I came to Canada in August 1970 and went to work at Simon Fraser University and immediately got thrown into drug addiction because I was assigned by the university to teach a course which I knew nothing about. The course was called Social Issues. I read the Vancouver newspapers and to find out what are the social issues in Vancouver. Well, in those days, the number one social issue was heroin addiction. It was big. There was a panic about why are there so many heroin addicts. I called a place in Vancouver called the Narcotic Addiction Foundation, and they invited me down and they put me to work as a psychologist talking to drug addicts. So I met all these young men and women from the downtown east side, but also from the Granville Street area. When I started talking to heroin addicts in Vancouver, I was only 30, and so they were maybe 25 years old, or maybe they were 20 years old. We were about the same age. So they could talk to me quite freely. And I would say, well, you're taking these drugs because you've lost your willpower, you can't control it. And they say, oh no, I can control it. I can quit any time, but I'm not going to quit because it's working for me. And I would say, well, how could it be working? How is drug addiction working for you? And they would explain that they really had no other life that they could live, but they could live the life of a heroin addict. They had friends who were other addicts and thieves and prostitutes, and that was their world. It was a world where they belonged to some extent, and it makes some sense to them. It was not as bad as being nobody at all, because they had a life. Why is it that people take those drugs, and why do they take such risks? I mean, the police brutality was very serious. The time they spent in jail was quite horrible. The risks were very high. Before the drug addicts in Vancouver started telling me these unusual stories, I really had no major interest in the field of drug addiction, except that it was a topic that I had to teach. After they told me that story, and I realized that story contradicted the official view of what was going on, then I was very interested in drug addictions. This is now 47 years. From then on, I've been very interested in that question and trying to find the truth about that topic. And the deeper reason is what the addicted people were telling me, the heroin addicts were telling me, made more sense than what my textbooks were saying in terms of my own personal observations. The problem was this, that in those days, everybody thought that the problem of drug addiction had been solved by rat research. Having rats in a little box, which we called a Skinner box, and having a little button they could press, and a little tube so that when they pressed the button they got an injection into their brain, essentially, of heroin or some other drug. It had been found that when they're in this little box, they will press the bar over and over and over again and take lots and lots of heroin. It seemed to be that here's a drug that if you allow any creature to have access to it, they will take it. They will just take it indefinitely, even though it eventually kills them. The answer was too simple. The reason we started Rat Park is that we thought that older experiment had been over-interpreted. We asked the question, what happens if you take rats and you don't put them in a little box? If you put them in a great big open area where they have lots of room to play and make babies and do all the things that rats like to do, then will they take the drug? And the answer is no, they don't. They don't take nearly as much. They don't take so much that it seems like they're going to be addicted to it, and they never take enough to kill themselves. So Rat Park seemed to be a way of getting rid of a set of experiments that were wrong. That is, the experiments of putting a rat in a Skinner box are wrong because you've isolated the rats, and rats never live in isolation. They don't live that way. They live in great big open areas with lots of other rats. And so we were very pleased when we did our Rat Park experiments because it seemed to close the door on those old experiments and on the myth that there are drugs which make people or rats lose control of their minds. The environment that we created in Rat Park was simply the floor of the laboratory, confined by plywood walls so that the rats could run around on the floor. It was about 90 times the size of a regular rat cage. Lots of little bark dust, shavings, wood shavings on the floor. It had things that rats liked to play with, like tin cans. The main thing, I think, was the other rats. Rats are very social. They form complex groups, and they mate and they produce babies. It's a pretty normal rat environment. In Rat Park, the rats had a little door that they could go through, and if they looked to the right, there'd be a water spout, and if they looked to the left, there'd be a water spout. And one water spout would have drugs in the water, and the other would have no drugs in the water. And the question was, how much drug would they drink? And we compared the rats in Rat Park to rats in cages, which also had two little spouts in their cage where they could drink either water or drug water. The results of setting up two groups of rats, where one are isolated in cages and the other are living in Rat Park, is that the rats who are living in the isolated cage drink way more drugs than the rats who are living in Rat Park. It's a big difference. For example, sometimes we'd force them to drink lots of morphine, and then we'd let them choose between water and morphine. Now, if the old story was correct, those who had been forced to drink lots of morphine would have to keep drinking it because they were hooked. Well, it didn't work that way. When you force rats in Rat Park to drink lots of morphine and then you give them a choice, well, they stop drinking the morphine. Even though they have withdrawal symptoms, they stop easily and then they just don't drink much anymore. Again, it seems that the drug addicts were telling us the truth, that even though you've had heroin for a long time, you can stop if you have a reason to stop, but you can continue if you have a reason to continue. The rats, if they're living in Rat Park, don't have a reason to continue. Vancouver is the most temporary city in Canada. Very few people who live in Vancouver are born here. Many of our neighbors on this street have come from someplace else. This is more true in Vancouver than almost any other city in Canada. And Vancouver has always been the most drug-addicted city in Canada. I think there's a connection. I think it's because when people come to Vancouver, they lose their old culture. They have to. They're leaving it behind, and they get thrown into a city where many cultures mix together. And that's fine if you have plenty of time to get used to it. When people first come here, there's a time when it's very difficult because they've left their old culture behind. They find something here, but what they find here is unfamiliar, and people are unfamiliar with them. That's why Vancouver has always been the most drug-addicted city in Canada. It seems like we can't shake our addiction problem, even though we've improved our methods tremendously. We have all kinds of good treatment. We have harm reduction. We have the recovery movement. All these things are wonderful advances, and we do not have the kind of brutality that we used to have here in Vancouver. But our problem is just as big, if not bigger. So just because we have improved our methods does not mean we have solved our problem. To me, that means that there is an underlying problem that we're not going to solve even by having better forms of therapy. And the deeper problem is that people need to belong in a place. They need to live in a culture which is stable and welcomes them, and they understand we are not so resilient as we like to think we are. And we need the world to be predictable, and we need the world to be respectable. And all that is weakening now. The response to Rat Park was amazing because many of the students at the university got quite excited. It's been published in all very good pharmacology journals, medical journals, but it sank like a stone. It disappeared from the discourse. Nobody paid much attention to it in academia because there was another countervailing theory that simply took precedence over Rat Park. So people forgot about it, really for a few decades. But now, Rat Park is being rediscovered. To my amazement, I thought it was dead and gone, but it's not. There's now a Rat Park comic book. There are books written about Rat Park. The idea that the drug addiction issue was settled by rat research in the 1960s has been replaced. It's no longer settled. And Rat Park is part of the unsettling of the theory which seemed it was so settled. There's lots of research on human beings which is pointing in the same direction as the Rat Park research. We can now talk about the issue of why people are addicted in a much broader way than it was in the 1970s and 1980s. The larger issue is whether addiction is something that we have to understand in terms of individual people, or if we need to understand it in terms of society. If we say culture itself is the cause of our widespread depression and anxiety and addiction, then we face a monumental task. People still want to say in the field of addiction that we'll find the solution if we just keep trying with different kinds of psychotherapy, different kinds of drugs, but they're failing. I think that we will eventually confront the problem of addiction as a social problem, and when we do, then we will be able to make some progress in it, but I don't think we've turned that corner yet. We stopped doing research in Rat Park around 1980. There's really two reasons why we stopped. One is that the university shut it down. But the other reason that it shut down, the situation was not as simple as we were thinking it was. In other words, some people repeated the experiments we have done with other rats and got the same results, but other people didn't get the same results. We, in our own laboratory, did an experiment that didn't work. And I thought, well, I could spend the rest of my life figuring out what exactly is going on with these rats. Really, they're just rats. And the Rat Park has given us a tremendous idea. It points us in a direction and says, here's some things which we need to know about why people get addicted. We can study people in other ways. How to find the answer to these questions using human beings rather than rats, because it's much more important, of course, to learn about human beings. What I think we can show by looking at research on human beings is that there are definitely societies which are so fragmented, so screwed up, that addiction is a major problem, and there are other societies which are just not that screwed up. Addiction is much less of a problem. We do this by comparing countries or by comparing people before and after their cultures have been crushed. What we find over and over again is that when cultures are crushed, there's huge outbreaks of addiction. I think we find in our own culture, as it becomes more and more caught up in our sort of super modernity, super high-tech, super commercial, super capitalist kind of situation, we seem to be finding more and more addiction among ourselves. I think we can make the connection between culture and addiction very clearly now. That's why I wrote The Globalization of Addiction. First Nations people have been studied all over the world. Here in British Columbia, none of the native people had alcohol until the colonists brought it. Then the colonists showed up, first as traders. So the colonists would come in and say, okay, bring us your furs and we'll give you some whiskey. Under those conditions, they didn't have alcoholism. As long as it was a trading relationship, and they would come in and trade their furs, take the whiskey, go home, get drunk, and then go out and get some more furs. The problem of alcoholism came when the natives were driven off the land, when we say, no, you can't hunt anymore because we need it for farmland. For example, we have native villages in British Columbia which have been destroyed, and some of which are succeeding in coming back together again, even though they don't have the land they had before, but they're doing other kinds of enterprises. And where this happens, where the native people have been able to rebuild their culture, the addiction rates go down. The question of addiction is a huge question. It's not just a philosophical issue, because everything depends on it. If we say, as I do, that addiction is built into certain kinds of society, and our society is one of the kinds which will inevitably generate lots of addiction, we've immediately stirred up a huge emotional response. Because what I'm saying is that this society that we all want to trust so much is absolutely ruinous and has to be replaced. Well, if I say that, I'm immediately in trouble. But I do want to say that, and I want to take the consequences so that we know what we're talking about. We're talking about big business here. We're much better at having panics and saying, well, okay, everybody's dying of fentanyl or everybody's dying of overdoses. So we mustn't let go of the fact that there's a fundamental philosophical issue here, which is at the foundation of where our society is going to go in the future. If we live in a world where we're confronted with a globe which is on the verge of nuclear war, environmental destruction, catastrophic mind control through all the media, we can't afford World War III. We can't afford environmental destruction. We have got to understand ourselves. And let's face it, there's so much pain. And the drug that people get addicted to and kill themselves with is the biggest painkiller. And it's not a coincidence that, the biggest consistent drug of addiction is the biggest painkiller. And people use opioids. There's no way that a doctor or a psychologist like myself can look at a person and say, oh, you don't really have pain. We don't know. All we can do is make sure that there's enough opioids available so that people don't have to buy fentanyl on the street. But that's not going to solve the problem. We have to address the pain, and we're not doing it yet.